In this video, I'd like to go over the key elements of the Israelite narrative. You can follow along on the document that was provided, which is what I'm going to be working with here also. Okay, so what we're trying to look at here is the kind of progression or evolution of the people of God, and particularly with the Israelites in the way that they receive God's revelation gradually, and that they are able to evolve and progress in becoming the people of God. So on one level, yes, all people are God's people. We have it in our inherent nature. We're made in his image and likeness, like we see in this first story. But there must be a choice, right? And that often involves some kind of education, right? Some kind of learning. And so we're going to look here now at the major elements and how the Israelites progressed closer and closer to a full realization of being the people of God. So we start with the creation in the fall, this first major element, which we focus a lot on in this course. We see that human beings are created good, right? This is a key thing that God is sharing about himself and his relationship with us in this story. Human sin brings evil to the world, but God loves humans anyway and helps them deal with the consequence of their sin. He also makes a plan, right, to free humanity from the bondage to sin that humans created for themselves. Right? We call that salvation. Right? So this is in Genesis 1-3 in the Bible. The setting is prehistory. Right? It's not about a specific set of historical events. It's about the human condition. Right? This is something that all humans have experienced since the first humans. And so the genre, we can talk about it as mythical. It's symbolic. There's not a historical, particular historical event that corresponds, but it's more like all the historical events will correspond to this because it's what it's about. It's what it means to be a human being. And it was written down, probably a very old story, but it was written down around 1000 BC when the Israelites started writing things down. And the form that we have it in now was probably edited around 500 BC. Sometime around the Babylonian exile. The next major movement that's kind of important is the idea of God forming this covenant, this personal relationship in which both sides have certain responsibilities with one person, Abraham. Right? So God begins, and maybe this word isn't quite right, but we can see, because again, his plan has always been in effect ever since human sin. But we can say he begins this plan in a special revelation to the Israelites through inviting one man, Abraham, right, to trust him and to follow him to an unknown land. And Abraham does this. He becomes the father of the Israelites, and the revelation that comes through trusting in God's plan of salvation, and we'll see here, enacting God's plan of salvation, right? Really choosing to be the people of God, gets started with him. And we see it's something that happens through choice, right? Not through force or coercion. So we can read about this in Genesis also. And we are introduced to Canaan, which will later become Israel in this story. Again, this is legend and folklore. Was there an actual Abraham? There could have been, but his name itself is a reference to some kind of patriarchal ancestor, father of nations. And so it's more likely that even if there was an Abraham, the story is attributed to him, or a conglomeration of legendary stories that have been passed down through various tribes throughout the ages. Again, the first time we have this stuff written down would have been during the Yahwist period in the royal courts around 1000 BC, but also then re-edited many times, particularly during the Babylonian exile. The next big event is the Exodus. So Abraham's descendants end up being enslaved in Egypt, and they cry out because they're being oppressed quite severely. I mean, they are enduring a lot of pain and suffering because they are not seen as full human beings. They are seen as tools of the state, right? They're not members of a just and free society. They are members of society which treats them like property and treats them like they were created to serve the Pharaoh, who is the king and the relative of the gods. So God hears their cries, and He sends Moses, who takes some convincing on the part of God to tell Pharaoh to set the people free. And then through a series of plagues, with the cooperation of Moses and some other members of the enslaved Israelite community, God frees the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. But He doesn't just free them to go out and join another oppressive society or to become an oppressive society themselves. He also gives them the Torah, which is called the instructions or the law of Moses. And it's instructions on how to form a just and free society. And we see this in various books in what is called the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it takes the Israelites out of Egypt into the desert on their way to the Promised Land and even to the borders of the Promised Land. Again, this is a lot of legend and folklore, although it is possible that some of these events really happened. Like there could have been a small group of slaves that escaped slavery in Egypt. Not the thousands and thousands that it says in the Bible, not all 12 tribes, but there might have been a small group that escaped slavery in Egypt that eventually ended up being the inspiration and the bearers of the revelation of a God who cared about the poor and the oppressed. And they might have made it up to northern Israel, where they shared this revelation with other disenfranchised and disenchanted people who had left the Canaanite city-states in Canaan, which will later be called Israel. So the historicity, again, you could have could be inspired, maybe you could say, by historical events, but the details of the story have most certainly been changed to emphasize the point that the stories were used to convey, which is that the revelation of a God who cares for all people, especially the ones that are poor, vulnerable, and on the fringes of society. So after the Israelites escape from slavery in Egypt, they eventually make it to the Promised Land. And in the Bible story, they invade the Promised Land in large numbers and do a military takeover. And then they exist as a confederation of tribes that help each other voluntarily. And it's not like the other societies of the time, which are oppressive monarchies. In the Israelite Society, the rights of the small landholders are stressed. And not just the workaday sustenance farmers, but the rights of the most vulnerable people are also stressed. The widow, the orphan, the immigrant. right? People who have been oppressed by these tyrannical monarchies in the societies of which the Israelites escaped. And so you have these people come together as a new kind of people in Israel. And again, the genre still here is a lot of legend and folklore here in the early days of Israel. And you might have some things that are based on historical events, but they're often out of sequence or fit into the narrative in a way to get a point across. For example, there was most likely no large-scale military invasion of Canaan. The Israelites, who all in the Bible story, they all enter Canaan in a large military invasion. 12 tribes are already formed. Archaeological evidence and research shows it was probably more likely that the Israelites formed within Canaan, right, as disenfranchised people, like peasant farmers um, and escaped slaves, gathered in the hill countries, in the northern countries, and just farmed in the wilderness. They were frontier people. And it does seem likely that a small group of people who had escaped from slavery in Egypt also made their way up to this area and settled there and shared the idea of this God who cares for the poor and the oppressed. And so they came together. And so they actually were more like, it wasn't that the Israelites invaded Canaan in mass and killed off all the Canaanites and took over. It was more like Canaanites who wanted to live a different way abandoned the city states and formed this new society, right? So again, and scholars think the reason that they talked about this large-scale invasion and how they just killed off the old Canaanites was as a statement to show that they were different. Like their old societies were dead. Those oppressive regimes, they were no more. They were a new kind of people. And so, these stories came up, scholars believe, as an expression of their disdain for the oppressive societies they lived in a way to assert their um, freedom from them. And this is the period that is reflected in Lofink's form of the people of God as a tribal society. All right, the period of the kingship. This is an interesting period because during the early years of Israel, you had people who escaped from the tyranny of kings, right, as emphasized here in the Exodus story, and they escaped from the king of Egypt. But here in the kingship period, which is only a few hundred years later, people call for their own king. And it's an interesting situation. The people ask for a king, that the prophet Samuel relays God's message that if you take on a king, you're kind of, in some ways, you are rejecting God. Because God had freed you from the slavery of kings. And now you want to put yourself back in that situation of being oppressed. But the people, because they want a professional army to defend them from the other professional armies of the other nations around them, they say, no, we want a king. And so the idea is that the Israelites would have a kind of good king, a pious king, a king who wouldn't do these things, a king who would follow the Torah, a king who would follow God's will and defend the rights of the poor and defend the rights of the small landowners, right? A new kind of king, a different kind of king, one who lived out God's will and not their own, right? One who actually helped the poor and the vulnerable members of society instead of taking advantage of them. It didn't really work too well. You do have some kings that are very, very good at heart, like David, You have some kings that try to reform and come back and follow the Torah. But for the most part, the story of the kings is the story of the prophets condemning the kings for not following the Torah. And that is that they were not taking care of the poor and the vulnerable people. Instead, they were taking advantage of them. They weren't defending the rights of the small farmer. Instead, they were taking their land and adding them to their own large land holdings. So this is also here an interesting time because this is the time of the Yahwist writers. And this is the time when you really do start to get a lot more historical accuracy in the narrative. Why? Because people are writing things down as they're happening. The kings employed scribes, and the scribes would write down the events of the day. In a particularly flattering way to the king, yes. But you also have a lot in these stories, you see a lot of anti-monarchical sentiment. People are saying, wait a minute, the whole thing about us is that we don't have a king. We're not like these other societies in which the will of the state or the will of the king is worshipped as divine. No, we follow God's actual will, which is what? To create, to form us into a community of loving persons, right? To form that just and free society. So an interesting time. And we do get a lot more historical events in here and things that are based on historical events. Why? Because people are writing things down as during this time period. You have a written record. So this corresponds to Lofink's form of the people of God as the people of God as a nation state. Now the next phase is the prophets in the exile. So the Israelites, especially the nobility, they didn't really, they weren't following the Torah. You know, they were supposed to be this new, different kind of kings, but they weren't. They were just like the kings in other countries. And they put their own selfish desires above God's will for a free and just society. And so the prophets are constantly, you know, admonishing them. But eventually, both the northern and the southern kingdoms are defeated. And the southern kingdom is exiled into Babylon in 587 BC. Now, this is the interesting part because in Babylon, they kind of figure the whole thing out. And they say, oh, you know, it's kind of like the prophets have been saying all along. It's not enough for us to just say we follow God, Yahweh, or make sacrifices to him and undergo all the ritual, you know, aspects of worship. You know, it's not enough that we go to church, so to speak. They had to also then put the meaning of those rituals into practice. They actually had to be the people of God. And they got this. They understood. They said, oh, we lost the land not because God abandoned us, but because we weren't taking his advice. We weren't doing what he said. And so how could his advice work, right? How could we form the society that he had called us to be if we didn't do what was necessary for it, right? It'd be parallel to like if your doctor gave you medicine but you didn't take it, or your physical therapist gave you exercise but you didn't do them, right? It's not going to work. And it's not that your doctor or your therapist is not, you know, doing everything they can to try to help you. It's that you're not doing your part. And so they really devoted themselves to trying to follow the Torah as much as they could, trying to follow that law of Moses that God had given them as instructions to form the just and free society during the exile. So you see a huge progression here. They really seem to start to get it. They really understand, kind of without any confusion, that, wow, like we have to do it. It's not just about being a fan of God, right? It's about our worshiping God, right? Just in the ritual sense. But we have to take his advice and put it into practice, right? And again, this is the time of the priestly writers, the P writers that we talked about with the Genesis story. And so you have a kind of a historical narrative here. Again, people are writing things down. There's a lot of verifiable documents. The people who reformed this in the form we have it now which, again, you're starting some of this stuff going into the 2nd century BC. They had older documents to work with. So you go back and look at what was written at this time as they're forming their stories. Now, they're not trying to make a factual history the way that people would try to do history today, right? They're trying to get a point across, but they're using historical events to make that point. And this corresponds to Lofink's forming the people of God as the people of God as a federation of synagogues. This is when the synagogue system, the kind of style of Judaism that we know today, got started. Okay, so then after the exile, the Jews are allowed to come back to Judah. This happens when the Persians defeat the Babylonians. And so most of them stay in Babylon because they're doing quite well there. And they have like strong Jewish communities. They don't really feel like they need to go back to Jerusalem to be Jewish, right? Because Judaism, as they discovered, was not about where you live, or it was about how you live, right? So they could follow the Torah in Babylon. And so most of them didn't come back. Some of them did come back, and they rebuilt the temple, and they kind of launched like a revival, and they said, we have to live the Torah now, right? We actually have to live the instructions. We actually have to live God's advice. So you can see people are like, you can see kind of a progression, how God starts with this one person and then moves on throughout the community, right? Showing people that it's up to them to choose to follow his advice. And so you do have a lot of historical accuracy in this part of the narrative. Yeah, everybody was writing things down while they were happening here. And one of the most famous people here is Ezra the scribe. So if we look at what we've been talking about here, a progression, evolution, right, and a gradual revelation. So the progression, the evolution is towards a full realization of the people of God, actually being the people of God, right? And now, again, of course, all people are God's people. We have that inherently. We're created in the image and likeness of God. But then the choice to live as God's people that Lofink talks about is what we're talking about here. So it's the realization of our potential to live a divine life here on earth. And so we also talk about the gradual revelation, that God is sharing this with us gradually, right, little by little, to help us realize it. And so God starts small, right? But then inviting one human being to trust in him, right, to go to a new land. And then in the Exodus, we can see that this invitation has grown into a whole community of people. And they're given the choice too, right? God reveals to them, hey, I hear your cries. I love you and I take care of you. And it's gone from one person now to a community, right? And he, again, then also gives them how to do this. And we'll see this growth where they start to try to actually, they have these instructions, but how do they put them into action, right? There's a certain revelation there too. You can't just say, oh, they have the Torah, that's it, the revelation's done. No, there's a difference between having the Torah and living the Torah. That takes God sharing himself with us too. And so then in the Confederacy, you see people doing this, and they're disparate people. It's these 12 tribes, and they're all different, but they're able to come together to help each other. Now, it's not perfect. They do fight with each other, and that's a good part. That's one of the things that we see in the Kingship. That's nice. The people all do come together as one. And so they overcome that tribal division. And you see a foreshadowing of the overcoming of all human division here, which is the fullness of the people of God. However, then you have this kind of unity, but it's not, there is an element of force in there too, as the kings oppress the people. And so the prophets, though, continue to be there. Like the voice of God's will is still there, telling the kings. And the kings are often remorseful and do sometimes try to change. They do try to come back to following God's will for a just and free society, right? Love of all people and not just their own selfish desires. The prophets in the exile, this is such an important period because you see more growth and development here too, because the people actually get it. Like they said, well, and it was the question that came to them, why did the exile happen? And it was, and the answer was, well, it's because, of us. We're not following the instructions God gave us, right? Be like if you were given, if you were assembling a desk or something, but you didn't follow the instructions and it didn't work. Is that the manufacturer of the desk fault? Is that the person who bought you or gave you the desk? Right? Or like I talked about earlier, if you don't take the medications or follow the diet or do the exercises that your doctor or therapist gives you, is it because the doctor didn't love you enough or the doctor didn't care about you that you're still not feeling well? No, it's because you didn't do what they said. You have to actually take the medicine. You actually have to do the exercises, right? You with me? And that's not, doesn't mean, you have to earn it, but it means that you have to put it into practice. You have to make that choice to become a society of loving persons, to become a free and just society. And in the Second Temple period, it's really everything's all lined up. So now they're free again, and they come back to the temple, and they are ready to go. And they are going to follow the Torah, God's instructions. But it's still that thing that they just kind of don't know exactly how yet, right? And some of them, again, not all of them, but some of them become very obsessed with following the Torah in a way that they kind of forget what it means. And they're so intent on following every letter of it, but they miss the whole point of it, which is that it's supposed to help you form a just and free society. It's supposed to help you form a community of loving persons. And instead they use it to be exclusive. They say, oh, well, these other people don't follow the Torah as good as us, therefore they can't be part of our community. It's a mistake that human beings make a lot. And so then as the Israelite narrative concludes at the end of the Old Testament, it's not right to say it concludes because it continues into the New Testament. But at the end of the Old Testament, at the conclusion of the Old Testament, we see where we are in the progression, and we haven't quite realized the people of God yet. Not in a full and authentic way, right? Of course, some members of the society have. They were always in there in the Israelite Society. But as far as a fullness where the whole society is living this just and free way, the whole society is living as a society of loving persons, a community of loving persons, haven't quite got there yet. So that's at the close of the Old Testament, there's still this apprehension, there's still this waiting, there's this anticipation of the realization, the full realization of the promises that God made to Abraham, right? And these promises were said by the prophets to be linked to the coming of a Savior King, the Messiah. And so that's kind of where the Old Testament closes. You see a lot of progress on the road to being the people of God. You see people understanding God better and better as God shares himself with us through these various historical events, right? These various trials and tribulations, right? And gifts that God gives us, right? And that's what's so interesting about the exile period is that the trials and tribulations are understood to be a gift too. It's something that God is teaching us, giving us something through those. But you can see, although they're very close, there's still a sense of anticipation. The promises haven't quite yet been fulfilled. And that's where the Old Testament closes.